My name is Andrew, and I'll never forget the day everything shifted. It started like any other, unremarkable, ordinary, almost serene. My dad, a man of quiet routine, had always been my foundation. After my mom passed, it was just the two of us against the world. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit subscribe and show your support for LGBTQ voices. Sharing these stories keeps our community seen and heard. Thank you for being here. Let's begin this unexpected journey. We'd built a life of simple comfort, leaning on each other without question. Our home wasn't much, but it was ours, a small, warm space filled with shared meals and muted laughter from the TV playing in the background. That night, I went to bed early, tired after a long day at work. My dad had mentioned someone might stop by, an old friend, I assumed, though he'd been vague about the details. I didn't ask questions. He deserved friends, company even. I'd seen him grow lonelier over the years, though he'd never admit it. Still, something in his tone had struck me as unusual, a softness or hesitation that I couldn't place. But at the time, I let it slide. Sleep came quickly as it always did. I was used to the hum of our quiet house and the distant creak of the floorboards. It was familiar. But that night, something was different. Somewhere in the dark, just before slipping into deeper sleep, I thought I heard soft murmurs. Voices, low and close. I frowned into my pillow, half awake, brushing it off as my dad watching TV or talking on the phone. It wasn't unusual. He often stayed up later than me, and his quiet presence in the other room had always been comforting. Still, a strange unease lingered. When I woke in the morning, the house was still and eerily silent, as though something had passed through it and left it hollow. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, soft against the walls of my small bedroom, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. I stretched, groggy, my thoughts still tangled with fragments of dreams. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps just outside my door, slow and deliberate. I pushed the blanket back and sat up, my pulse inexplicably quickening. The door creaked open just a sliver, and I saw my dad standing there, his frame still and his expression hard to read. He was holding a mug of coffee, steam curling up toward his face. He seemed different. It wasn't anything I could point to directly, but I felt it, a hesitation, a quiet tension in the way he looked at me. "Morning," he said finally, his voice softer than usual. "Morning," I replied, my throat dry. I rubbed my eyes and tried to shake the feeling of unease that had settled like a weight in my chest. "Sleep okay?" he asked, a strange edge to his question, like it carried more meaning than it should. "Fine," I said slowly, studying him. "Are you okay?" He blinked, his lips parting slightly as though he was going to say something, but then he stopped himself. He nodded instead. "I'm fine. Just tired." "Who was here last night?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. I knew someone had been. That much I was sure of. His gaze flicked away, just for a second, before returning to me. "Just a friend," he said simply. There it was again, that hesitation, the word friend hanging a little too heavily in the air. I didn't push it though. If there was one thing I'd learned about my dad, it was that he didn't offer more than he was ready to give. He left the room then, the door closing softly behind him. I sat there for a moment, the sound of his footsteps fading down the hall. Something didn't feel right, but I couldn't explain it, not yet. I got out of bed and padded into the kitchen, where the faint smell of coffee still lingered. My dad sat at the table, staring down at his cup, a man deep in thought. He didn't notice me at first, or maybe he pretended not to. "Everything okay?" I asked again, quieter this time. He looked up, startled, and gave me a small, tired smile. "Yeah, Andrew. Everything's fine." But it wasn't. I could see it in the lines of his face, the way his shoulders slumped slightly. My dad had always been a steady presence, a man of few words but unshakable certainty. That morning, though, he seemed fragile in a way I'd never seen before, like he was holding on to something too heavy to bear. I didn't press him. I sat down across from him, sipping the coffee he'd poured for me. We didn't say much, just the occasional word about plans for the day or whether I'd remembered to take out the trash. It was normal. Or at least, it was supposed to be. But as I watched him stare into his cup, lost in thought, I realized something had changed. I didn't know what it was yet, but I felt it, like a shadow creeping in at the edges of everything I thought I knew about us. And though I didn't understand it then, that quiet morning marked the first crack in the life we'd built together. The silence between us was no longer comfortable. It was heavy with something unspoken. Something I wasn't ready to hear. I didn't know it yet, but my world was about to shift. All I could do was wait, and wonder what I'd missed while I was sleeping. The house was quiet when I returned that evening. Too quiet. The kind of stillness that hums in your ears and makes your pulse quicken. I tossed my keys onto the kitchen counter and noticed the faint flicker of light coming from the living room. My dad was sitting there, his back to me, and someone else was with him. I could hear low murmurs, soft, deliberate, the kind of conversation you don't want overheard. Something twisted in my gut. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the faint glow outlining their figures. My dad sat close to the other man, their heads tilted toward one another in hushed discussion. The man leaned in slightly, his posture intimate, familiar. I could only make out silhouettes, but it was enough to set my thoughts racing. Dad? My voice cracked the silence. My dad jolted upright, his shoulders stiffening as he turned toward me. I stepped into the light, and for the first time, I got a clear look at the man sitting across from him. He was younger than my dad, late 30s, maybe, sharp-jawed and effortlessly put together. His presence was quiet, yet commanding, like he belonged there, even though I'd never seen him before. The man's gaze flicked to me, and for a moment, there was something unreadable in his eyes. Too calm. Andrew, my dad said, clearing his throat. You're home early. The tension in the room was palpable, like a storm gathering right over us, thick and inescapable. I glanced between the two of them, searching for answers in their expressions. My dad wouldn't meet my eyes. I didn't mean to interrupt, I said slowly, my voice steadier than I felt. Who's this? This is Chris, my dad said after a pause, the words landing awkwardly. Friend. There it was again, friend. The word was hollow, a placeholder for something he wasn't ready to say aloud. Chris didn't speak, but his slight smile felt like confirmation of something I couldn't yet grasp. The room seemed smaller now, suffocating. My dad looked tired, his face lined with hesitation. It was like I'd walked into a conversation I was never supposed to hear, a moment not meant for me. I didn't know you had company, I said, still searching for an anchor in the strangeness of the moment. Chris finally spoke, his voice smooth and measured. We were just catching up. The calmness of his tone only made my unease worse. I glanced at my dad again, and for the first time, I noticed the shift in him. Something in the way his shoulders sat, the way his eyes darted toward Chris and then back to the floor. It was subtle, but undeniable. It wasn't discomfort, it was something gentler. Familiarity. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my hands curling at my sides. My mind raced to make sense of it. My dad had been distant lately, more secretive, often lost in thought. I dismissed it as stress or loneliness, but now, pieces of a larger puzzle were falling into place. Chris stood then, breaking the silence. I should go, he said simply, glancing at my dad. There was no awkwardness between them, only understanding. He didn't look rushed or uncomfortable. If anything, he seemed steady, like he'd done this before. My dad nodded, his expression unreadable as Chris grabbed his coat and headed toward the door. I stepped aside as he passed, catching the faint scent of cologne and something else, something I couldn't name but that left me unsettled. The door closed softly behind him, and I turned back to my dad. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He stared at the empty coffee table like it held all the answers, and I tried to find the right words to cut through the silence. Who is he really? I asked finally. My dad's shoulders sank slightly, his fingers tightening around the mug he still held. He didn't answer right away, but when he did, his voice was low. He's someone who's been there for me. Someone you care about. The confession hit me like a blow I hadn't seen coming. My chest tightened as I tried to process it. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them. Careful, deliberate, like a truth he'd kept locked away for longer than he could bear. You mean you're? I stopped, unable to finish the sentence. He finally looked up at me, and the vulnerability in his eyes was something I'd never seen before. I didn't plan for you to find out like this. The room felt colder. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but nothing came. My dad, the man I thought I knew better than anyone, was suddenly a stranger to me. How long had he been keeping this part of himself hidden? How many late nights, whispered phone calls, and lingering silences had I missed? I didn't want to hurt you, Andrew, he said softly, his voice heavy with emotion. I didn't know what to say. I didn't even know what I felt, anger, confusion, betrayal. It all swirled together into a knot I couldn't untangle. I turned away from him, unable to meet his gaze anymore. I need some air, I muttered. I grabbed my coat and walked out, the night air hitting me like a slap. My heart was pounding, my thoughts spinning. The world I'd known, safe, predictable, had tilted on its axis. My dad had crossed a line while I was sleeping, and now there was no going back. What hurt the most, though, was that I wasn't sure I wanted to. The night was still when I stepped outside, the cold air sharp against my skin. I stood on the porch, hands shoved into my pockets, staring at the empty street. The quiet should have been calming, but my mind wouldn't stop. My dad's words echoed in my head, soft, measured, and unfamiliar. He's someone I care about? I couldn't reconcile it. The man I had always seen as steady and uncomplicated had suddenly revealed a side of himself I'd never known existed. It felt like betrayal, even though I knew deep down it wasn't. I leaned against the railing, exhaling into the night, the breath curling like smoke. I wasn't angry at him for being who he was. I realized that much. I was angry because I hadn't seen it coming. The door creaked open behind me, and I heard the soft sound of my dad's footsteps. I didn't turn around at first. I couldn't. He joined me on the porch, standing a few feet away, his silence deliberate. I figured you'd want space, he said after a long moment. His voice was careful, like he was trying not to break something fragile between us. I just needed to think, I replied, my words carrying less bite than I expected. About everything. He nodded, his eyes on the dark horizon. I know it's a lot. I turned to look at him then, and in the dim light from the porch bulb, I saw him differently. My dad, this strong, stoic man, suddenly seemed human in a way I hadn't allowed him to be before. His face was drawn, his shoulders heavy, as though he'd been carrying something for too long. How long? I asked quietly. He glanced at me, startled. How long what? How long have you been hiding this part of yourself? His gaze dropped to the ground, and he hesitated before answering. Years, he admitted. Since before your mom passed. I thought I could bury it. That I could be the man everyone expected me to be. He paused, his voice steady but laced with pain. And then Chris came along. He wasn't supposed to matter, at least not in the way he does. The truth of it hung between us, heavier than the night air. I wanted to be angry, but I couldn't summon it. I could hear the years of loneliness in his voice, the guilt he'd carried for wanting something more. I thought about all the nights I'd seen him sitting alone at the table, his thoughts a million miles away. For the first time, I understood what that silence had meant. You were afraid of telling me, I said. It wasn't a question. He nodded. I didn't want to lose you, Andrew. After everything we've been through, you're the most important person in my life. He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine. I need you to know that none of this changes how much I love you. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my emotions in check. My dad had always been my rock, the one who stood steady while the world fell apart around us. Now he was the one who needed me, and I wasn't sure how to give him that. I don't know how to feel about it yet, I admitted. But I'm trying. That's all I can ask for, he said softly. I never wanted to hurt you, Andrew. I just wanted to be happy. The simplicity of it cut through me. Happiness. Something so basic, yet something he'd denied himself for years. My anger began to dissolve, replaced by something quieter, something closer to understanding. I thought about Chris, about the calm steadiness he exuded, and about the way my dad had looked at him, like he'd found something he thought he'd lost forever. I want to know him, I said finally, my voice low. My dad turned toward me, surprise flickering in his eyes. You do? Yeah. I shrugged, not quite meeting his gaze. If he's that important to you, I think I should try to know him. The relief in his expression was unmistakable. That means a lot to me, he said. More than you know. We stood there in silence for a while, the chill in the air slowly becoming bearable. For the first time since that moment in the living room, the tension began to ease. My dad didn't have to say it aloud, but I could feel it, that unspoken gratitude for my willingness to meet him halfway. I'm not saying I get it all yet, I said, breaking the silence. But I'm not walking away from you, Dad. His smile was small, but it reached his eyes. That's all I need to hear. The house felt warmer when we went back inside. My dad poured us both cups of tea, the quiet between us no longer strained but filled with something softer. It wasn't perfect. There were still questions I couldn't ask yet and answers he wasn't ready to give. But for now it was enough. I sat down on the couch while he took his usual chair, his mug cradled in his hands. The hum of the TV filled the space, and for the first time in days, the silence felt like home again. I looked over at him and thought about how much of him I'd never really known. Maybe that was okay. Maybe it was time to see him, not just as my father, but as a man who deserved love, even when it came in unexpected ways. Dad? I said after a while. He looked up, raising an eyebrow. Yeah. I'm glad you told me, I said quietly. The softness returned to his face, and he nodded, his voice almost a whisper. Me too, Andrew. Me too. And just like that, the weight between us began to lift. We were still us, different maybe, but still us.